is it working again? Yes.
Good morning.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. Good morning.
Your volume,
Yeah.
you're muted.
What?
It doesn't show that you're muted. I don't hear anything.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, my volume's up. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. You're hearing me?
I hear nothing.
Well,
On the land right now because, as Pastor David said, I'm a counselor here. I always, this is my political joke, I'm not the kind of counselor that cares about people. It's a political role. But that's my funny political joke because politics is a interesting animal. It's I'm kind of like you have a mayor and city council, and so we have chief and council, and we're elected. It's part of the Indian Act. It's under the Indian. We don't always use the term Indian anymore. Some parts of the states and here we're adamant about using it, but generally we say Indigenous. But we still have something called the Indian Act in Canada, and that's the where we have the elected chief and council system. So I'm serving in that capacity here, and also working with Canadian Baptist Ministries on a part-time basis as their Indigenous relations. So those are two things, and normally I don't talk about those things or what I do. That's it's for Indigenous people. The way we introduce ourselves is just to talk about the land. And when we want to know something about you, we say, like, if you meet an Indigenous person, probably the first question they'll ask would be, well, maybe what's your name? But the identification, the second way of identification is where are you from? So when I meet another Native person, say they're from the Chumash reservation, and then I'm like, oh cool, I know a little bit about you guys, that's awesome. Or I meet different ones from different places, White Mountain Apache, oh that's interesting, so you kind of know a little bit about who people are based on land. And it's a very, very different way of identification compared to Western or sort of European-based Americans, Canadians, because that's all about they get your name and then what do you do? And what you do is sort of your identity. It becomes your identity. And we don't do that. What do you do? The question, what do you do, doesn't come up until way later in the conversation, if ever. And so it's an interesting way of being for Indigenous people, and it points to the most important thing about us. The most important value that we have as Indigenous people is the value of the land. That is, and you'll hear, I don't know if this is an American thing, but in Canada, it's one of the more discriminatory things to say to a Native person is, oh yeah, you guys just want your land back. You're always crying about wanting your land back. And it's interesting. It's true. We do want our land back. Excuse me. Let me just have a drink of my coffee. I don't know what is up with I've always got this ahem. I'm going to cough. You can't cough in a microphone. It's like explosion level loud, right? Just kaboom. So, okay. Now I lost where I was at. The land. The most important thing about us is the land. And so, well, I'll carry on with what I was going to say. The land is, you can kind of have like an emotional connection to land. You can say, oh, that place was my hometown. That place was my my birthplace, or I remember these memories from a vacation there. You can have kind of like a connection to place because of emotion. And that's true for Indigenous people for sure. But there's also for us, there's a spiritual connection. And our stories say that we've been on the land time immemorial. It's gone out of memory how long we've been on the land. Most of our stories don't talk about walking there or getting there or whatever. There's no, we don't have islander stories like, we came from someplace else. Most of our stories talk about the Creator placing us on the land. And that's an interesting difference. And folks, anthropologists and explorers and such, they always talked about our stories as myth. And Vine Deloria Jr. wrote a book. One of his books is called God is Red, and another book is called Custard Died for Your Sins. Tough books to read as Christians, but important stuff in there. He passed away he was a very distinguished elder, but he talked about how our stories are sometimes history, sometimes they're good stories, sometimes they're moral stories, but he was the one who first said, you Christians tell us the story about a man who was swallowed by a fish for 3 days, and a man who walked on the water, and you want us to believe your stories, but when we tell you our stories, you say they're myths or legends. So that imbalance, and he was one of the first sort of thinkers and strongly challenged the church as an Indigenous man. So the land, my Daket story, Natle Watan story, I was told by the late Chief Stanley Thomas. He told a story, the creation story. He didn't tell the whole one because that was a couple days long, but he said, summarized it by saying that the Creator placed us on our land, gave us the land not to own in a common law property ownership, like a British common law property ownership sense, but to watch over. And so that's a responsibility. That's a spiritual connection, and it's mandated by Creator. So there's that kind of connection that we Indigenous people have to our land as well. And I used to, and I love talking about this because it's our elders. One of my favorite elders, the late Cecile Ketlow, she said in a meeting one time years ago, she said, it's about the land. It's always about the land. And those words just stuck to me. And I've felt a connection to Natle since I was young. My mom was born here in Natle, and she grew up here. She went to residential school, one called La Jack, and she had that connection to this land, of course. She married my dad, a non-native, and they moved an hour and a half away to Prince George. But she was homesick, and she missed her sisters, her dad, and the land, and so she came back all the time. So I would always tag along with her as a kid and as a teenager, and so I also spend a lot of time in this room here. The house hasn't been renovated since 1969. It's a very old place. I love this house, and the window that's open a lot now because it's getting a little bit warmer. The trees are just starting to bud up here. But when the window's open, when the window's closed, you can hear the rapids from the river. But I've got it open now so you can hear the nice from the river. And in the summertime, when the trees are full, there's a lot of wind that comes off the lake and comes from the west, and it blows in behind the outside the window at my grandpa's house, or now it's my auntie's house here. And that sound of the trees and the sound of the river has always spoken to me. I've always felt sort of something in this space and in this on this land, and a really deep connection to this place. And it's not just a native thing that the land speaks to us. I think if you go out on the land, you sense something of Creator. You sense something that's bigger than you. Every single one of us has this ability, and it's not a mystical kind of Pocahontas thing. And none of us actually, kind of we all have, I don't know, Pocahontas was so bad because it gave people so many stereotypes of Indigenous people. Um, uh, but this one concept of hearing something or hearing creator speak through creation is actually a biblical thing. The first way that the way that God makes himself known to us is two ways. The first way is called general revelation, which is that God speaks through creation, and that the Bible says that man is without excuse, that we all should be able to realize that there's a creator just by looking at the sea, the mountains, the the wind and the trees, and it's beautiful. And the second way that creator is made known to us is perfectly through the work and person of Jesus Christ. And so studying the life of Jesus, you can just see the creator. We get this deeper understanding of who creator is. And so Indigenous people tend to find themselves in that first way of knowing of, the land speaks and signs, seeing an eagle. Everybody loves to see an eagle, but to us it's a good sign, and it's a sign. It's not the creator when an eagle shows up. It's a sign from the creator. And so we're very Indigenous people have this very beautiful spirituality, this beautiful way of being, and it's very very close and connected to land. When I moved here a few years ago and was living here all the time, well, when I was a kid, my mom would drive here, and we would she would visibly relax, and she would be so happy to be home, and I would then of course relax as well. She's my mom, and she could well anyway so as we'd come into the Notley, and I just always felt like this place was good and beautiful. So and that connection always happened. And we had some missionaries that were here one time. My mom became a Christian when I was around 9 or so, and when I was a teenager, she started bringing Christians here and have missionaries and having prayer meetings and different things. And I remember one of the missionaries sitting in my grandpa's living room, and I was like 14 or whatever. And the person said, there's a little hill you come down, and then you can see the river, the bridge, you can see the Notley River, and then just on the right hand side is a little blue house where I'm at right now. And if you ever come up this way to Notley on your way to Alaska or something, I don't know, Californians I hear do that. Pop in, come and say hi to my Auntie Irene. She would love it. This is not live on Facebook for everybody to come and pop in on us. Don't know, just the church. Only this church in California. Anyway, but these missionaries, they were sitting in the living room, and they said, as we came down the hill, we suddenly felt the oppression. And I was like, what? And I've always kind of wondered about this kind of stuff, because I thought, am I spiritually really, really dumb? Or is this person mistaken? And these people are the authority, right? They're older Euro-Canadians, they're Christians, they've been Christians for a long time, and so they must know this stuff. And so I kind of feel like, okay, there must be something wrong with me that I don't feel that, or they're seeing something that I need to learn. And so I'm kind of but my feeling was about this place is that I love this place. I love my grandpa's house and the land and the river and swimming in the river and our little mountain. And, so there was a disconnect. And I've since learned, I was at in a class with Charles Ring, my regent, and he talked about how in missions it can be culture shock, that kind of a experience there, culture shock, and also, of course, the enemy of our souls pushing back on any time we try to do something good for Creator, right? And he helped me to realize, to have a bit more grace for those people, instead of just saying, you guys were so wrong and you were so hurtful to call our land and our place dark and oppressed. But that kind of thing, it sort of rides in the psyche of people. You've heard about the you might have heard this, or it might just still ride in your psyche. It's like Canadian Christianity. If you talk about the res, they will assume it's a little bit more dark or evil than any other land. And it's sort of like, okay, and there's like spiritual stuff behind that, or there's, spiritual teachings and stuff behind that. But what I've often found is generally the places that are more dark are places that we don't know about. I mean, when we don't know about something, we tend to fear it. And so getting to know some place or some people is a giant step towards maybe more understanding and reconciliation, hopefully. So this land, and I remember being in another church when I was the same age. I was early teens, and somebody came up to me, and I always had like, now I have this lighter hair, but anyway, I always had like dark hair, and a lady came up to me and said, "You're Native," and I was like, "Yep, I am," and I said, "I'm from Notley," and I was always very proud to be from Notley, even though I knew that their face would change when they found that out. Or when we talked further, and of course their brow furrowed and got pensive, and then when I said I'm from Notley, she said, "Oh, there's a lot of darkness in your community, isn't there?" Or on the maybe she said on the reserve, isn't there? And I was sort of like, and I wish I could go back in time and say yes at night, but I unfortunately was just a teenager and had no idea that this was, whatever. And again, I'm thinking, this is church. This is a grown adult. This is a person who should know what they're talking about. So maybe there's something bad about us, and that was the process of colonization and Christian colonization, and the weaponizing of the gospel for Indigenous people, to say that there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong with my land, and therefore I can't, Richard Twist, the late Dr. Richard Twist Lakota, he used to say, God loves you, but he doesn't really like you, and that's how we kind of felt as Native people. Like there was always something a little bit off about us, and God was just kind of like, and it was, and so all of these things are attributed to us, that the land is dark, and that we're spiritually dark, and that we're always backsliding, and we're always, never, whatever. And there was another prof of mine, Rick Watts, who I asked him one time, "Did I quote you right?" And he was like, "Close enough." So I keep quoting him, "Close enough." But he said, and his background is Australia, so he's talking about the Indigenous people there, I guess, but it applied to me. I felt it deeply when he said, if Indigenous people don't understand the gospel within their own worldview, do they ever truly become Christians at all? And so when people say, why have Native people always fallen away from God? And it's like, because you didn't give them the gospel that, in a contextualized way, placing the gospel within the context of a people. You gave them your church culture gospel. And we've gotten really good as Canadian Americans of exporting or sending culture missionaries. If you go anywhere in the world, you can go to a church and you're kind of like, oh, it's a different language, but I know this song. I shine, Jesus shine. You can sing along with that song, and it's like, they're just like us. This is amazing. I feel so at home here. Why do you feel at home there? It's because it's an American church that you've planted in Mexico and Russia and Japan, everywhere. It's translation. It's not contextualization. And we export. We send missionaries to all these other countries, and they are not, or they haven't always done a good job of contextualizing the gospel. That's changed in the last bunch of years, since maybe Lausanne. A lot of things have changed since then, but for Indigenous people here, still the idea is Indigenous people should come to become Christians. They should give up their culture because it's dark. They should probably move off the land because that's dark too, and just become like everybody else. And it's like, okay, that's assimilation. That's not transformation. That's not, the miracle of new birth. Doesn't mean I just, can take off my skin, rip out my native soul and become a white person. That's not the gospel. That's not good news. Um, and the weaponizing of the gospel happened in the Indian boarding schools in the United States, residential schools in Canada, where they told Indigenous people that, or they used the gospel. They used the gospel instead of giving it as a gift, as it's intended. This beautiful, the most beautiful story I have ever heard in my life is that for Creator so loved this world that he sent his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have life forever. That's a beautiful story. Life forever for a kid whose earliest memories are standing around the grave, and we have a lot of grief in our lives. We have a lot of death, but it's not because we're like poor and, sad, but it's because we're connected. We know so many people. We know other First Nations communities close to us. So this, for a kid whose earliest memories are of loss, like new life forever sounds beautiful, but that wasn't the gospel we were given as Indigenous people. And still in most places, in a lot of places, I should say, it's not the contextualized gospel. What does it mean to be Indigenous and Christian? We're given this this version. It's scary. If you try to change who you inherently are and become a Christian and try to adopt a new worldview, it doesn't work. It ends up being a scary caricature of what you're actually supposed to be, who God really intends us to be, who God created us to be. And for Indigenous people, that means connection to land, and that means a strong spirituality. Every Indigenous community in Canada and the United States has a story of the Creator. Every one of our communities, a story and a name of the Creator. And one of my favorites was, again, it was the late Dr. Richard Twist who talked about Takanshala in the Lakota language, which means grandfather. And of course, when I heard this, I was like, oh no, and I was a Christian and I was in grad school and Bible school, and so I'm like learning all this stuff, and when this stuff comes to me, I'm like, oh no, is that okay for us to say grandfather? Because the Bible, Jesus doesn't say, when you pray, say our grandfather who art in heaven. Is it okay to say that? Because I've heard God has no grandchildren, and of course I had all of this stuff because I had all this baggage because when I was a little bit younger, I think I was in the undergrad program, and somebody was talking about a song by one of the Vineyard guys. I've lost his name now. David Ruiz. He wrote a song called Gitchi Manitou because he was pastoring in Winnipeg. And he wrote a song called, the Gitchi Manitou means Great Spirit. So some pastoral leader was talking about this, and they said, oh, you can't say Gitchi Manitou. You can't say Great Spirit. That's a false god. That's an idol. And I was like, oh, and scared because, again, this is an authority figure. And I had to, in Bible school, I remember one of the profs said, how do we know that our God is the one true God? And how do we know, when we're talking about God, that it's not a false God? That how do you identify that? And I'm just sort of like listening, like, tell me. I love Bible school. I always say theology set me free. It really did. It really helped me to realize how bonkers history and people and Christians are. And I was like, oh, now I get you guys, Arminianism and Calvinism. Oh, anyway, but I forgot what I was talking about now because I just started thinking about that. God, what's wrong with me today? Grandfather, how we know God. Okay, I'm reeling it back. Thank you. I see some of you guys going to help me. But how do we know that our God is the one true God? Well, when we look at God's characteristics, God's attributes, it's called in theological talk, but personality traits. So God is love, God is good, God is justice and mercy, all of those things. And God never acts outside of those personality or character attributes. And so when you see something like Baal or Moloch, they're doing crazy things and they're asking people to do crazy things, we kind of like go, okay, that's not God. This is not. And so God would never ask, for you to sacrifice a child for a city. Like, that's not God. And we see in Abraham and the story of Abraham and Isaac, we read that story and we're horrified that God would say, go sacrifice your kid. And all of us are like, oh my goodness, what is going on here? We don't know how to read this. But in that culture, you don't hear Abraham saying that stuff. Abraham doesn't go, what? How could you? And fainting couch time. No, Abraham just goes and does it because it's common culture in that day. It was common for those crazy gods to ask that kind of stuff. The crazy thing in Abraham Isaac's story isn't God asking to go sacrifice. It was when God stopped Isaac from sacrificing his son. When God says, wait, I will provide a sacrifice. Both Abraham and Isaac, probably, because Isaac is a young man, he's not a kid. He probably could have fought Abraham off if he wanted to. But both of them are like, yeah, this is how you do things. When God says stop, that's when they would have been like, whoa, this is different. So this is who our God is. We know these things. So I asked different elders in my travels, can you tell me the story, the name of Creator? Can you tell me a story about the Creator? And they were always very gracious. And some of the names are so beautiful. And I found that Indigenous people have what they would consider their spirituality and their way of being. But if we dare label it, we could say it's kind of like an Old Testament view of God, and beautiful signs, very high, deep respect. A lot of the Indigenous people say the first, when you wake up, the first thing you do is you give thanks, to the Creator, and they would name the Creator. Then the Creator, the stories are so beautiful. It's the one who made everything, the one who started everything. Amongst my people, the translation for our name for God is the being up on high. And so there's the separateness from creation. That's important, because a lot of people who think about Indigenous, and again, Disney's Pocahontas, it's like, thank you very much for having, we could write theology against that. As Indigenous people, we're always having to sort of defend ourselves against stereotypes. Oh my goodness. But that separation of Creator and land, of course, very interconnected, very close. God is very close to creation. Not like the Greek thought, where God is way up in the heavens and heaven is way up in heavens. I mean, we're always like, when you think about Greek thought, it's different from Hebrew thought. Ancient Hebrew thought is that the earth is very connected. The earth and the spirit world is like this, right? And this is Indigenous thought as well. But Greek thought is like the spirit world cannot touch the world of matter, because it would be ruined, and it would just become like that. So it has to be very far away, and so it has to be kind of like up in it has to be like in the atmosphere. It can't be in space, because that's weird. Right. So, but where is heaven? Like, it's like all of these interesting ways of thinking: Greek thought, Hebrew thought, Indigenous thought. I like this one, that we're a lot more closer than we think. And that makes the earth good. Greek thought makes the earth bad. And it makes us misuse the earth. It makes us waste things or litter, or it's all going to burn anyway. That's the kind of thinking that'll lead us down that path. Thinking that God is very connected with the earth. That'll help us to have a tremendous amount of respect for land and for the earth. I think that's something, again, that Indigenous people can teach us. So all that to say, and in my journey of having to sort of like hear Christians like talk to me as an Indigenous person and just have all these assumptions about our lack of, whatever, like nobody, what is it? I always say that Columbus, everybody sort of has this idea that Jesus stepped off the boat just after Columbus, and that we're like, thank you, Savior Columbus. And it's like, it's so not true. When a good pastoral method that I was taught in Bible school was when you walk into the hospital room, when you walk into any room, you just kind of, Eugene Peterson says this. He says, you just sort of like be humble and just have a look around and see what Jesus was up to before you got in there. And that's beautiful. Like what was Creator up to here in indigenous communities before settlers came? You know, lots of beautiful things, lots of beautiful stories, beautiful ways of knowing God and understanding God. One of the stories, one of the names is Wakan Takan for God, the great mystery. That beauty, that power, we can understand God. And when I was a kid, I think one part of my salvation experience was reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where I had come to faith because of a preacher yelling about hell all the time, and I didn't want to go there. So I became a Christian, but I wouldn't have stayed a Christian, I think, because I always say you can't stay in a relationship with someone who's always mad at you. And that's how I felt about God. I was terrified of God. And then reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and sort of seeing how C.S. Lewis contextualized the gospel for children. This lion appears and it's Aslan, and I'm like, hey, I know this story. And I'm a little kid. I'm 8 years old, and I'm reading this story, and I'm like, oh, and it unraveled that angry God for me, and it gave me this whole new way of faith. And I always think about what is our indigenous Aslan? You know, how do we, and it might be in my mind grandfather, which is when you think about the ancient God, this ancient being, no beginning, no end, this one, and grandparents, some of you are grandparents, you have grandkids, and when just as soon as I say the word grandkids in a church, I saw it. A lady teared up and started like having to brush tears away because she was so happy thinking about her grandkids. That's a level of love that you don't know as a parent. I certainly didn't. But this ancient one, grandfather, and in our communities, the elders are the top of, they're the highest, they're the most respected people. They're supposed to be the most respected people in our communities. They're the storekeepers, the identity holders, the language holders. They're, they go first, and when you have food, we send them first. So talking about God as an elder in a Native community is actually quite a powerful way to think about Jesus. It's different, but I work with a bunch of different Indigenous folks across Canada and the U.S. I work. One of my favorite things to do is to be a part of NAITS. It's an Indigenous learning community, NAIITS. You can go online, and if you Google that, we're having a symposium. You can register for that. It's all, of course, Zoom. We were supposed to be in South Dakota this year, but of course, we're all staying home, staying safe. Please join us. It's Indigenous theology. We're indigenizing the gospel. We're taking back the story. And I think that's what happened during the Great Reformation. Like I always think, the Great Reformation, Martin Luther in Europe, how they wrestled the gospel out of the hands of the church that was getting far too powerful and far too corrupt, and taking, they're the ones that they had this secret language. The Bible could only be written in, it was only written in Latin, and the priests were the only ones who knew that. So nobody really knew what the Bible was saying. So, the priests could just, anyway, it was awful days. But what did Martin Luther do? He went and translated the Bible into German, and he was at the pub a lot because he's German, and I have German relatives, I could say that. And so he hears some cool tunes on the piano, and he takes that back and he puts Christian lyrics to it, and everybody knows the tune, so they just learn these new lyrics. What is he doing? He's contextualizing the gospel. So I think we should change the name from the Great Reformation to the Great Contextualization. Hello, because that's what those guys were about, right? John Knox in Scotland, and John Huss in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia area. Like they were putting the gospel in common vernacular, Koine Greek, if you will. And that's a beautiful thing. And so for us as Indigenous people, that's what we're trying to do, trying to make sense of the gospel and taking something that was used in the residential schools. They took the gospel, and the government of Canada had to apologize. We asked for an apology for 25 years or more, and they took Canada to court, our residential school survivors, and they won Canada's largest class action suit. And Canada had to apologize. They wouldn't apologize for years because, of course, apology leads to, it says liability, right? The government had to say that the policy of these schools where Native kids were taken out of their homes, ripped out of their homes by off police and stuff, taken far, far away to these residential schools and not allowed to speak their language, not allowed to wear their regalia, and all the stuff, horrific stuff. There's terrible stories of abuse. If you do some research in it, it's a dark, dark chapter in Canadian and American history. And the government had to apologize and say we realized that these schools didn't have I'll summarize and paraphrase it to make it how I understood it, but they didn't have a policy of education. They had a policy of assimilation, and that's not the gospel. The gospel is transformation, and it's that beautiful spirit-filled, spirit-led, and it's not behavior modification either. I there's a lot of my life where I thought that, and heard a lot of preachers yelling around about behavior modification. I went to a lot of really bad churches, didn't I? Bad theology when I was a kid. But thankfully now, I think that we can start to see clearly. We can start to see through this foggy haze of what somebody wants us to be, or expects us to be, or hopes us to be, and just be who Creator wants us to be. So this grandfather, I'm leaning into this ancient one in Daniel. It's the ancient one. We hear the term Ancient of Days, the Alpha, the Omega, all of those beautiful concepts of this great mysterious God. And that's the one I'm leaning into, because grandfather, if God loves me like a grandfather, then I'm good. Like I'm getting a chocolate bar, and I'm getting grace, and I'm getting humor and playfulness, joy, and when you see a grandparent light up when their grandkid walks in the room, and we see, because of these COVID days, grandparents can't visit, so you see grandparents visiting through windows, and there's one kid who invented that plastic thing so they can hug their grandparents, because there's such a unique relationship. And so I'd like you to think about that in the next week or so. Just every once in a while, just think about, hopefully you have good grandparents that are a good example. We're a good example to you. Or you are a grandparent, and that deep, deep love, that love that you don't understand until you are a grandparent, right? Think about that in terms of God loving you, and how he just lights up at the thought of you, maybe tears up at the thought of you. That powerful, incredible love that our ancient Creator has for us. So yeah, some of my thoughts, and some of my I appreciate getting to talk about Indigenous values, the Indigenous value of land, the Indigenous thoughts of Creator. So thank you for letting me share. I appreciate this.
Yeah, I hope we can get you back and pick your brain some more, get more out of you. But this is one of our guys, Webb Mealy. He put in chat, imperial religion, which says become like us, is the opposite of Jesus, who became like us.
Oh my goodness, that's great.
I thought so.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you everybody for being a part of this very special time. Let's do whatever we can to support the people in our world around us, but one another in particular, since we know we have friends in one another. Cheryl, we hope to hear from you again soon. All right.
Yes, sounds
Yeah,
good.
so there's some clapping going on again. All right, people.
I love it. You guys are beautiful. I feel at home here with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be in touch with you soon. All right, Cheryl?
Okay, I'm going to
Okay.
jump out of here then.
Love you,
Much, much love, dear
everybody.
church. Yes, bye.
Oh, God.